I'm listening to some CDs right now of speeches given by a man named Ram Dass. And he said something at the beginning of one of his talks that I loved. He goes, "I'm not coming in here as some spiritual guru who knows everything and you know nothing. Rather, we're coming together to remember what deep down inside we all know to be true." I love that. Somewhere deep inside, our soul already knows what is true. That's why when you hear something at points in your life, you go, "Oh, yes." You'll read a book with a really great point, and it's not so much that you learned something new, it's that you recognized it to be true, right? Oh, of course. It's like you're remembering something you've forgotten. I've said before that when our souls come on this planet, in order to sort of make sense of it and live and thrive, we kind of get this like template, this way of seeing the world that orders everything for us. It kind of has to try to figure out, okay, good, bad, us, them, right, wrong. And it's how a majority of us will live the rest of our life. But underneath all of that is this soul that God created that knows something deeper, that knows something wider and something richer. So a year ago, I was on a plane and arriving in India, if you remember. I was there for 2 weeks, and I met some amazing people while I was there. One of the women who was on the trip, named Patricia, she'd worked in an international school as a teacher her whole career. If you don't know what an international school is, around the world in different countries, you might have these schools. And this is because, and I went to one when I was a little girl and lived in Tanzania. It is people whose parents came to another country to work, and they send their kids to an international school. And where I went, it was of the British school system, and I was surrounded by kids from all over Europe, as well as Chinese, Japanese, Indian. It was sort of like the UN. I think I was the only American, by the way. So she taught in these classes, and she remembers and told me this story about this one boy who was considered trouble. Nobody wanted him as he was going up the grades because he was a handful. He would have outbursts. Some people thought he was kind of violent. But she had different eyes. And she saw a kid who was desperate to be loved. And she knew just enough about his home life to realize it made a lot of sense why he might be acting the way he was acting. And so as they were setting the class for the next year, she said, "I want him in my class." And everyone else was like, "Good." And the minute he walked into her class, she goes, hey, you, come here, you're mine." And every day she told him how much she loved him. She told him how smart he was. She praised everything he did. She'd find the littlest bit of talent and she would foster that. And because these international schools were small enough, she could actually watch him as he went through the rest of school into high school. And when he graduated, he told her that because she had been who she was to him, it had changed his life. He had begun to see himself differently from what everybody else told him he was. She was telling me that she believed as a pastor that that was her calling. That was her calling as a human being, to see these kids differently from what the world often would see them as. And you may know, too, that when you continually tell someone this is who you are, eventually they start to believe it. That's how the world works. If you tell someone they're bad, eventually, guess what? They become and act in that way. If you tell someone they're not smart enough, if you tell them they're less than, if you tell them whatever you tell them, eventually, when we're young, we start to soak that in. We think, adults surely must know something I don't. And you start to believe that story. what do we know to be deeply true? That a lot of what people tell us about who we are and what's right with the world isn't the whole story. Not at all. In the story we have today, a lot of the stories we might get so familiar with, but I just want to break it down a little bit for you. Because here you have this Samaritan woman, and let's just think about who she was. The Samaritans were essentially Jews. But see, what had happened is in the Babylonian exile, which we spent like a whole month last fall talking about because it was such a big deal. When the Babylonian exile happened, a lot of the elite families were the ones taken off into exile, and sort of these other poorer people, maybe without any reason for the Babylonian government to pay attention to them, stayed. But with the temple destroyed, they kind of rearranged their own faith and religion, and they worshiped on a mountain because that hadn't been destroyed. And then 90 or so years later, here come all of these Jewish families back, and they rebuild the temple and they rebuild Jerusalem, and all of a sudden Jerusalem in their way is the sort of order of things. And the Samaritans became second-class citizens. They kept separate. The Jewish people were a little bit prejudiced about how good they were, and the Samaritans were beneath them. So the Samaritan woman, it says that she was married 5 times. And let's think about that. Because in our own modern idea, we might have some prejudices about someone who's been married and 5 times. But in that time, women could not divorce. They didn't actually have a choice in their marriage. So maybe when she was 14 years old, she was married off to a particular man, and maybe he died. And so she was married off in Levitical marriage to his brother. And maybe that brother died too. And then maybe she was married off to the third, and maybe he went off to war and he died. Somehow she made it through 5 husbands, not her choice, and clearly didn't have any kids, and maybe by after the 5th husband, nobody wanted her. Maybe they thought that she was a black widow. Maybe they thought that she was just bad luck, no kids, no husband. And maybe the man she was living with, for all we know, was her brother. Maybe it was her sister's husband who took pity on her and allowed her to come and stay. We don't know who this person was. But what we know is that in a society in which a woman's literal entire worth is wrapped up in her ability to be a wife and a mother, she was none of that. And she was a Samaritan. But see, oftentimes it doesn't matter if you've been the victim of circumstance, because in our world we're very judgmental. And so I can just imagine that village, even though these things happened to her, the village may very well have marked her as a black widow, talked behind her back, shunned her, not invited her to social gatherings. And so she comes at noon in the heat of the day, not in the morning to draw water like most people would. She comes at noon to draw water so she can avoid the crowds, keeping her head down and living her life. And I bet you anything that she had somehow embodied that message, that she was less than, that she was not wanted, that she was not worthy. And that is when Jesus shows up. And I do not want us to underestimate the power of this interaction. Because Jesus sees with completely different eyes. I don't know when that happened. I don't know how it happened. But we know that by the time he began his ministry, every time he looked at a person, object, or situation, he saw it fundamentally from a soul level. He remembered what most of our souls have forgotten. And he didn't buy any of the stories that we use to divide ourselves and to shame and fear and guilt and judge and condemn and harm one another. He didn't buy into any of that. So he was able to encounter people as a beloved sacred child of God who deserved and had their own human dignity, and he treated them as such. And as he encountered and treated them as such, something in them went, "Whoa, he's right." And so he encounters, first of all, he's a Jewish rabbi man encountering a Samaritan woman, outsider. If he was a normal Jewish rabbi man, he would have fled the minute she came to the well. He wouldn't have spoken to her. That was improper. He could have been accused of flirting with her. But Jesus doesn't care about that stuff. Instead, he says, "Can you give me a drink of water?" And she comes at him a little feisty. Maybe she's tired of all of it. Why are you asking me? Blah, 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 blah. And they start to get into this conversation. This story is great just in case you have someone who tells you women should be quiet in church. Because here is a woman face to face with Jesus who should by all means be deferential and quiet and serving, and she's not. And Jesus never once tells her to be quiet. In fact, he keeps going with her. He gets into a theological conversation with her, and the more she pushes back, the more he takes her into deeper and deeper waters until finally, for the first time in this Gospel of John, he says, "I can give you living water." And she's like, "Well, that sounds interesting. Where can I get this living water?" And he says, "It's me." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "I'm the one you've been waiting for." And she's like, "I see it." He's not said that to anyone yet. She's the first because he sees in her something that can hold that genuinely, truly. And in that interaction then, when he says, "Go tell your husband," and she goes, "I don't have a husband," he responds by telling her the truth of her life without blame and without judgment. He just says, "Yeah, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with is not your husband." And there's nothing in that sentence that puts any blame or shame on her. It's just the truth of what's happening. And that may be the first time in her life she's ever heard that she's not been blamed or shamed for her predicament in her life. And that changes everything. And in that moment, her soul remembers her worth. And she sees there has to be something special about a person who can see through all of the stories to who she really is. And that's when she runs back to this community that has shamed and excluded her, but she doesn't care anymore. Because for her to tiptoe around them, which means somehow she buys into what they're saying, and she doesn't anymore. She remembers. Her soul remembers. And now she's just thinking about their benefit. You guys, my soul remembers. I think your soul needs to remember too. You see, Jesus opened up the reality of God's reality to her and pulled her in, and she was so glad for it. And now she wanted other people to experience it. So she runs back to the community and she says, "Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did." And there had to be something in her that made them go, okay. And they invite Jesus to stay for a couple days, and Jesus unfolds them into his reality. And at the end of the time, when Jesus is walking away, the village, which was once fragmented, is now restored, and they say to the woman, "It is no longer what you've said, but we've seen for ourselves. We have come and seen." Their water has been turned into wine. That's the Jesus effect. That's what Jesus wanted to do to every person he encountered. Remember what your soul has forgotten. Let me show you how to transform your water into wine. Come and see for yourself the reality of God. That is the power that Jesus can hold. But if you remember last week, we had the Nicodemus story, and the reason Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman are put side by side is because they're a parallel. If we had a lot of time and you were okay with 10 minutes of a Bible reading, we would read those together. Because here you have a religious, powerful man, a landowner, who by all means is on the top of the hierarchy, creeping around to Jesus at night, not quite sure but intrigued, and not quite getting it. He can't follow Jesus where he's going. Jesus says, "How are you, a spiritual teacher, not able to understand these things?" Fast forward, and Jesus goes to a Samaritan woman in the middle of the day and high noon, do you see the difference? A woman with nothing, a woman who is an outcast. And as he starts to theologically talk with her, she's with it. She's there. She follows him all the way to the end. Complete and utter opposites. And one of the things we can learn from this story is that those who have power, for whom the system works for them, are often the ones who don't get it and are the last to change. And the ones for whom the system has hurt them and excluded them and marginalized them and oppressed them are the ones who are so thirsty for something new that the minute they hear the truth, that deeper truth, they're the first often to see it and recognize it. So I think about that now. Us today. We have had people like the Samaritan woman, the cast out, the talked about, the whispered about, the judged, the shamed. There's a lot of people that fall into that category. And oftentimes they've cried out and said, this country is unjust, this world is unjust, this church is unjust. But too often we are kind of like Nicodemus. It works just fine for me. What are you talking about? And we don't get it. We can be so slow to wake up to what people have been screaming about for generations. I had an interaction with a man who I knew from North Dakota. Did I tell you this story last week? Okay, good. All right. I can't remember what I've told anymore about this. But I had posted something, and he responded, and he got upset with me. I'd posted something about what's happening in our city, in our community, in our state right now. And he got upset with me. And so I said, but did you actually watch the video? Are you actually listening to the stories? Are you actually opening your eyes to the truth of what's happening? And he kind of pushed back at me a little bit, and I felt so frustrated. And then I had an awareness, and here's what it was. I was getting so mad because he wasn't believing me. Because I have heard from pastor after pastor after pastor after neighbor after friend over and over again, and some of you have told me your stories of how you are seeing the pain in our community with what ICE is doing. And I'm holding all of those stories, and now I want to be one of the ones who's saying, hey guys, we need to fix this. And to not be believed is frustrating. And that is how some people have felt their entire lives. I have the privilege of just now realizing how frustrating it is to not be believed. But we have members of our community who have not been believed from the time they were born because of the color of their skin, because of their gender or other identities, because of their ability or lack thereof. That they've experienced, like the Samaritan woman, what it is to be excluded for absolutely nothing they ever did, and they weren't believed. What we do when we come together as a church, when we're at our best, is we remember what our soul has forgotten, what has been buried by these stories of the world, which are always less than. They're always superficial and small. And what we remember is that we are really all one. We are all siblings, brothers and sisters of the one God, all equal and beloved in our worth, just in different spacesuits. Mine is blonde and Norwegian. We've forgotten that. And when we come together, maybe we can remember through songs and through stories from the Bible and through confession and forgiveness and through communion, the absolute inherent unity that is true. That saints and mystics will come back and go, you guys, I just had the craziest vision. Did you know we're all one? And people are like, yeah. No, for real. We're all one. We're all beloved. We're all the same. All these stories we're hearing, it's not real. we're seeing a beautiful resurgence in our community of taking care of one another and collaboration. But I do want to clarify one thing, because there's a message out there that says, this is who we are, Minnesota. We show up for a potluck. This is what we do. Funeral committee can put together a funeral for 200 in a couple of days. This is who Minnesota is, with the great collaboration that's going on. But I disagree a little bit. I think this is who all people are underneath, but sometimes it has to be pulled out of us. Because we have not always listened well, like Nicodemus. We here in Minnesota, good Lutherans, have sometimes been more like Nicodemus than we've been like the Samaritan woman, okay? But sometimes, when the cry comes just right and we wake up, what's capable, that beautiful soul inside of us that does understand that we are all beloved, that we are all the same, to protect and care for one another, to go grocery shopping. Oh my gosh, if you saw the feeds of all of the people over this last week who are pooling together money, almost $200,000 has been raised in Bloomington in less than 2 weeks to feed and help our neighbors here in Bloomington. And there are constantly people who are grocery shopping, and there is a mother who will stand at her children's bus stop with a whistle to make sure that her kids' friends aren't harassed or hurt or taken. That is so brave and so beautiful. It is what we're all capable of. Sometimes we just have to remember the unity that lies beneath. My prayer is that on Sundays, when we come together, our soul remembers something. My prayer is that when we come together, that all of the week's chaos and madness and intensity, that when we come together, we're able to see that through God's reality, through God's lens, through Jesus' energy, and not our own. That we're pulled once more into God's beloved sanity, which gives us a framework that we can go out in the world and truly be a blessing, truly offer that to others as well. May that be true for each of us. Amen.